Good morning and welcome to day 3, a glorious morning here in Adelaide. I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting this morning on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and my honour to them for their long and continued management of the land, the sky, the seas and the other waterways of this area. This is the final day and the second last live stream session of the 2025 NHRA Forum. Welcome to everybody here in the room in Adelaide. Glad to see you've made it back. And to everyone online in Australia and around the world. My name is Kate Vinot. I'm one of the board members at NHRA. For my sins, my background is as an engineer and a socioeconomist, but more on the end user side of things. I've been working in climate change, in environmental sustainability and in community engagement for many, many years in the utilities sector and in local government. And as a result of that, I have had the great pleasure and fortune to have worked with or met Mark on that journey. And Mark's our next speaker, Mark Duckworth, who will be exploring the very thought-provoking question, do governments trust communities? Mark has more than 30 years' experience in the Victorian and New South Wales public sector, leading significant policy and legislative reform initiatives in intergovernmental relations, multicultural affairs and public administration and security and emergencies. So he covers pretty much many of the topics that we've been exploring over the last 2 or 3 days. He brings a deeply informed political perspective to this topic. And Mark, I've spoken to several people over the last few days who've very much been looking forward to this session and your thought-provoking topic. So I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Kate. When I talk to some of my former colleagues in government and tell them that I've written a report entitled Do Governments Trust Communities, they say invariably to me, I presume the answer is no. But beyond that, we need to ask, why is this question important? And the reason it's important is because trust is the glue that holds our society together. And without it, we see fragmentation and polarization. What I'm going to speak about this morning is based on 2 reports, one entitled Do Governments Trust Communities, that came out last year, and another which will come out in the next few weeks called Removing Barriers to Trust Building. And my colleagues, Christine Hall, Michelle Grossman, and Michelle O'Toole were involved in that research. So to start off, for the academics in the room, that I'm aware that trust is a slippery concept. Whole books have been written about it, and it's difficult to pin down. And there are many of the greatest thinkers of the last 50 or 60 years, Anthony Giddings, Francis Fukuyama, Robert Putnam, amongst others, who have written on it. There is a vast literature on this topic, and during the course of this presentation, I will be referring to very little of it, but we start off with a broad definition of what trust is. And I think it's important to realize that it's based on emotion as well as experience and evidence. And it's a reciprocal relationship. That for a trusting relationship, you need predictability and reliability, confident expectation of future actions, and also vulnerability. And this is an important thing. Anthony Giddings said that trust acts as a protective cocoon. It actually means that people can live in an environment in which they feel protected, often by the actions of government or some other organization, because they confidently expect that when certain things happen, there will be action which they have predicted. As I said, that trust requires people to open themselves up to a degree of vulnerability. and it provides a way for us as social beings to navigate risk, uncertainty, and complexity. But it can be broken, and often is broken, when one party does not act in accordance with our expectations. Sometimes trust involves risk, as trust may be misplaced. We may trust somebody who doesn't act as we expect them to, and that trust is therefore broken, and the protective cocoon does not protect us. It's also important to recognize that trust works in a number of different ways. It's not just vertical from government to communities and the other way, but certainly horizontal as well. And it's not a static thing. It is a multi-systemic and dynamic process of flows. It moves around and is built on networks as well. We talk a lot about community, but what actually do we mean when we talk about community? Because all these different communities government engages with, geographical communities, communities of interest, communities of identity, communities of circumstance, and then online communities, which may be all of the above as well. And we're part of multiple communities. And the other thing we often forget about is that government agencies are in their own way communities with their own culture and process and language. And that is sometimes one of the things that we have to navigate. Trust also involves risk. It is a risky investment. But the alternative to trusting is for us to disengage from social relationships or attempt to use fear, control, and power to force the other party to behave in a way we find trustworthy. So trust is essential if we want to live without fear or control. One of the big issues that's written a lot about today is what's called the trust deficit. There are all sorts of reasons why this has developed, and it's been going on for a while. But it's also the case that this deficit is not the same everywhere in the world. It is, as we know, particularly bad in the United States. It's not as bad in Australia or Sweden. And part of that is because of the relationships between governments and their communities. But it is a worldwide phenomenon. And people have been analysing both vertical trust and interpersonal trust for many years. The Pew Research Centre has been studying trust in government since 1958. And this, as you can see, this downward trend, a few spikes, and then it goes down again. And this is a phenomenon which is the same everywhere in the world. But we now have a trust crisis. The Edelman Trust Barometer stated, "We find a world ensnared in a vicious cycle of distrust fueled by a growing lack of faith in media and government. Through disinformation and division, these two institutions are feeding the cycle and exploiting it for commercial and political gain." And we see this happening around the world. Just as we are here today, we see countries where this is particularly the case. You've seen this slide earlier when Ariella was speaking, but I think one of the key things here is, of course, when you look at these trends over time, is that not only is misinformation right at the top, but number 4 is social polarization, number 7 is inequality, and number 10 is erosion of human rights and or civic freedoms. These are the top 10 global risks ranked by the World Economic Forum from their 2025 Global Risk Perception Survey. And in 10 years' time, they expect extreme weather events to be number 1, but we still have misinformation and social polarization amongst those top 10. In 2025, Edelman Trust Barometer said Australia has slipped into distrust territory with a profound global shift to acceptance of aggressive action and deepening fears, giving rise to a widespread sense of grievance. And one of the important things to recall is that when we look at issues around extremism and violent extremism, there are many drivers, but one of the main drivers one finds in people taking on extreme views is a strong sense of grievance. And that grievance may be against other people in their own country or against government or against civic institutions. And when distrust fuels that sense of grievance, it becomes a particular worrying trend and something which we really have to be concerned about. Trust is also not equally distributed across all communities. There's significant evidence that government officials have different levels of trust towards different communities. That people who speak the language of government or act in certain ways may be trusted more by government officials and agencies. This is often not a conscious thing, it's usually an unconscious thing, but there is a tendency to favour those who are most like us. There's also undoubtedly the case that the wealthy and the well-educated have higher levels of trust than more disadvantaged groups because they find it easier to navigate systems within government. And treatment by government officials means that for some groups in the community, distrusting government authorities appears to be a rational choice because of their experience. This issue is drawn out again a few years ago in work that Edelman did on trust and this trust gap. As this chart indicates, there are two different trust realities in Australia. And this gap, this 22-point gap, is really very big. That between what Edelman calls the informed public and what he describes, I don't necessarily like the term, but he describes as the mass population. And this is a particular issue that when you have these two parallel trust realities working side by side, that the things that governments do and government agencies do, the language they use, the information they put out, often is taken up and understood and believed by people in that section, the informed public, but is not accepted or believed or understood necessarily by the mass population. And beyond that, we have seen a significant decline in support for expertise. The experts themselves are distrusted. And that when someone says or comes up with evidence and goes to somebody who has a view and said, well, the evidence shows that you're wrong, there is significant research which shows that people become more entrenched in their views and that evidence does not, in fact, counter this lack of trust in information. And people in the emergency management sector, this is a particularly worrying issue because we depend on people trusting the information that we put out. And if they don't trust the information we put out or the analysis we have of a particular situation, then people are not going to act in a way that we assume. And this is a further graph from this year indicating that Australia is in that distrust area. It's particular for people, as it says, some low-income people, but even people higher income, we've actually slipped down the rankings so that we're in this neutral space, which is important as well. Around the world, leaders know that trust is a must. A few years ago, the World Economic Forum said, we have an epidemic of misinformation and widespread mistrust of social institutions and leaders around the world, and the divide is widening. This is extremely worrying. We know that trust is a must if we are to solve the challenges we are facing as a collective. Now, this collection of millionaires and billionaires and world leaders have indicated that they're deeply concerned by this. But one of the questions is, why is this distrust happening and what can we do about it? One of the reasons that community trust in government has collapsed is that governments often don't trust communities. Because trust must flow both ways, not just for communities to government, but from governments to communities. because trust is a relationship involving one party trusting another and that trust being returned. So reciprocity is one of the key things for a successful relationship of trust to be created and maintained. There's been a lot of research on why communities no longer trust governments. But the reverse question, do governments trust communities, has been rarely asked or researched. So reciprocity is the bedrock of how trust flows and how it is maintained between governments and communities. It applies to those relationships. But trust is made or broken by behaviours. If the way agencies or employees act does not create trust, then their policies will not work. Government agencies need to be aware of how they do things, that how they do things is as important as what they do. And those behaviours revolve around these key concepts of reciprocity and vulnerability, which are essential for relationship building, transparency and openness, which are important for creating awareness and familiarity, respect and empathy, and increasing cultural awareness and competence, and those things are important. Establishing communication strategies which understand and respect confidentiality and reliability, and developing methods for constructive collaboration. So these behaviours and processes are things that can be done in order to help build this relationship of trust. Because trust is central to emergency management. A number of years ago, FEMA, when it was still able to do things, put out a very important report called A Whole of Community Approach to Emergency Management. And one of the key things they said is that trust is a recurring theme. It acts as the glue that holds us together, strengthens and sustains solidarity, and supports the means for collective action. But the important thing, as they say, is it requires more than conventional outreach focused on trust issues. It requires collaborating with communities in joint activities designed to address specific local problems. Trust is also at the core of resilient communities. And 15 years ago, it's amazing to think it's 15 years ago that the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience was written, but it's still, parts of it are still relevant and things that we need to focus on today. Empowering individuals and communities to exercise choice and take responsibility is one section. And this, as that strategy says, requires the availability and accessibility of transparent, accurate and trusted sources of information in various forms and provision of tools to help communities understand and act on the material provided. So why is trusting difficult? One of the things is that we live in the public sector, often lives in a world of hierarchy and control. Government policy and programs are often done to communities and not developed with them. Communities are often seen as problems to be managed rather than partnerships or partners to be worked with. And that is one of the things. And the research that I've done, and over the last 2 days have heard from research that many other people have done, this point keeps coming through again and again. A second thing is that the benefits of trust building are difficult to cost. And I think that one of the things that important is that it's difficult to persuade treasuries sometimes to invest in trust building because, as was said the other day, you can't, bring a media to cut a ribbon in front of avoided costs. The benefits of physical capital are easier to calculate than the benefits of social capital. And one of the things that we have learned through our work, and many others have learned through the emergency management sector, is the importance of investing in social capital. Trusting communities can also be risky when communities come up with things that don't line up with government priorities. So if governments already have policies and programs in place and communities say we want something different, that sometimes create problems. And I've heard this comment, sometimes writing grants is not our strength, but delivery for the communities is. And this is an important thing. Do we favour those people who are good at grant writing over those who can deliver for communities? Governments also need to invest time in developing and maintaining relationships. And I've heard this again and again. Frequent changes of personnel stand in the way of trust. People in communities build trust relationships and the person goes somewhere else. We also have a situation that the more senior a public servant becomes, the more time they must spend with ministers and the less time they have to spend with communities. And so communities often see that the relatively junior level of officials given responsibility is indicating that, in fact, this relationship is not particularly important. Also, the issue of risk-taking against vulnerability and control. It's often difficult for government officials to take a risk to trust some communities. And so we have the problem is that government documents are often filled in words around empowerment and co-design, but it is not possible for a community to have agency and be empowered and for governments to control the process at the same time. You can't have empowerment and control. And there is something which I have been told by an official saying that they'd rather be criticised by communities for not giving them agency rather than by the Auditor General for something that went wrong. And so this risk aversion is often built into the way that we do things. What can be done? Well, we can't do everything to solve the issue of trust. We can't, as a sector, take on malevolent actors who are deliberately spreading disinformation. But we can take certain steps that can help build trust. Clearly, governments are better resourced and need to take the time and effort to move away from the traditional top-down way of working, but we can identify some ways to do it. One of the things that there's very little training in how to build trusting relationships. In people working international aid, there's often a lot of work done in how to build community relationships and how to create those relationships of trust. And we train people for that. But in the emergency management sector and in the public sector more generally, we in fact don't do that. One of the things we suggest is there needs to be training across the whole sector and the whole public servants where there are people engaging with communities focused on these issues around building and maintaining relationships, increasing cultural awareness, and developing methods for collaboration. We also have a problem that accountability requirements should be robust but not too onerous. Too often, government grants and funding processes are very restrictive and focused on achieving government outcomes that involve overly burdensome accountability mechanisms which some communities are not equipped to meet, creating a sense of mistrust by government in the community integrity. There's a view which we've heard from many communities that these onerous accountability requirements indicate government does not trust them to be able to look after their own needs. There needs to be innovative ways of managing accountability and evaluation that focus on what has to be achieved, not merely on how much was spent or the outputs. And this is a discussion that I think should be held with the accountability agencies, that there needs to be another method of working that in fact allows accountability for community grants that in fact achieves their outcome of making sure that taxpayers' money is properly spent, but in fact does not have such an onerous effect. Because I've heard from some people, some community leaders who are saying that with small grants, the conditions applied to them are so great that it's just not worth their while applying for the grant at all. Communities can help improve trust, and there's certain things that communities can do. As I state here, taking on increased responsibility for their own affairs where resources permit. But governments will also need to provide resources that allow and build that type of capability. some issues. So there's some things that happen that people, neither side, governments or communities, want to read something in the paper before the conversation is taking place. There also needs to be better understanding of government processes information, but governments have a responsibility to make information more accessible and provide better training in this regard. But governments in particular need to improve trust by demonstrating through actions that they value community experience and that community empowerment and agency is real. They need to provide the resources and time and funding for relationship building, deliver on promises and be transparent if they can't be fulfilled, focus on longer-term outcomes rather than shorter-term actions, and making announcements in a media release while discussions with community members are ongoing can undermine trust, and we all know of occasions where that has happened. There also needs to be greater cultural competency, capabilities and awareness by government workers. And we need to also focus on limiting personnel turnover, or where this is not possible, developing better processes that enable trusting relationships to survive changes in staff and overall increase trust-building activities. We've had a lot of discussion about co-design and co-production. Done properly, co-design can really help trust, but so often government agencies use the term co-design as a fancy word for collaboration. But full co-production involves government and users of communities both being responsible for designing the service and delivering the service. And that type of full co-production does occur in occasions, and I know in the health sector it works really well, but it's something that we don't get that full co-production in terms of what we deliver. In our report, we've included principles and guidelines and a trust checklist, which takes people through a whole set of issues, including around cultural awareness and competence, relationship building, and asking a whole series of questions around do government agencies and decision makers give enough time to building and supporting the relationships? How aware are you of the cultural differences between your culture and those within the community you're engaging with? Series of others important, which is officials taking time to co-design, but when talking about community-led, actually letting the community to lead. There are other ones as well, than these key concepts which I've discussed before around reciprocity, reliability, empathy, accountability, transparency, responsibility, respect and confidentiality. And we have had this trust checklist used, and indeed in the Australian Multicultural Framework Review that was published last year, they used this framework when talking with communities across Australia, and it's something which resonated with many community leaders. So there's some things to consider for people in government and emergency services organisations. Are relationship building efforts and activities well resourced? Do government agencies and decision makers allow sufficient time to build and sustain relationships? What strategies are in place to reduce the impact of staff turnover? And how can government agencies better respect and accommodate the time pressures and commitments of community members? Because we often have assumptions about people being able to devote their time to it while they're not in paid employment for that particular function. So these are just some of the things to consider. There are many more indeed. And the last thing I want to end with is that reciprocity is key to the power of networks, exerting a governing logic over them. The alchemy of mutual give and take over time, turning into a golden trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Mark and I are going to stay up here together to field questions. So I'll encourage you now to pop some questions up on Slido, which we can see here. But before we do that, and while people are gathering, also we have some roving mics. Lena's got one over there, so I'm looking forward to you popping your hands up. But what struck me, a couple of things struck me from your presentation, Mark. First of all, how neatly it bookended with some of the stuff that we heard on the first day with Ariella Helfgott and others talking about the risk of fear and how fear could turn into conspiracy and grievances and how important that was to address that. But the second one flows right through what you talked about, and I can't remember the phrase, and I do hope someone comes up to me afterwards to actually tell me exactly what it was. But in terms of listening to our Indigenous communities this week, one of them said that you could only move forwards at the pace that you can build trust. Wasn't the exact quote, and I would love to have the exact quote, but I think what you've just outlined is what we hear all the time from the Indigenous communities, that you cannot work forwards and achieve things together with community, First People community, all communities, without that time and effort to build relationships.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that I heard that comment too, and that's one of the phrases I've also heard. You can only go at the speed of community, which is similar, because sometimes government programs say, well, we've got 12 months funding, we need to do this and that, and let's move things along. And come 30 June, the program needs to be wound up. I know in communities in Victoria post the 2019, 2020 fires, that there was a lot of funding for community organisation groups, which is now coming to an end. And I've heard directly on comments about what that means, because communities are still recovering, as we know that a quick recovery is not good recovery. But again, there are time frames where the kind of the recovery process is now out of sight and out of mind, and we move on to the next thing. And I think that's one of the key elements, is the importance of providing that funding on a longer term basis to allow those relationships to be built and sustained. Because, one of the things which I mentioned in that chart, and other people have mentioned this too, is that we tend to engage with communities during the crisis, and when there isn't a crisis on, everyone kind of says, those relationships decay. And building a relationship of trust in the middle of a crisis is really, really difficult, as we've seen in particular during COVID pandemic.
We have a question from the floor here.
Yeah. Ross, just a simple grunt volunteer from SES. But there were two things that you mentioned as impediments, and I'm just going to throw for discussion points of why those sort of exist and how the heck we get around it. One, you said grants, again, local communities find applying for grants difficult.
Yeah.
And government has brought in a lot of red tape. Is that not, unfortunately, because of litigation in the past and governments trying to protect themselves? And again, you talked about the change of government personnel dealing with people in communities. Isn't that also a problem, a generational problem? I mean, I had 2 careers over 46 years. My son, who's 24, I imagine will have about 20 careers, because that's just the way current things are going. How the heck do we...
Well, I think there are two things. First, as I mentioned, that it is possible to devise a more appropriate set of accountability arrangements, because I think the accountability arrangements have been put in place, and there have been, worst cases happening, some money gets misappropriated and you end up with a whole range of things. And it's important to be accountable and be able to know where money is being spent. But what I'm suggesting is, in fact, there needs to be a different set of arrangements that provides sufficient transparency and openness and accountability, but without being too onerous. Because I think one of the consequences, as I touched on, is that the feedback we've got is that the conditions on the grant often are seen to restrict a community agency to do what they want to do, because it says we're giving this grant, this is how it's to be applied. So your communities are therefore implementing government policy, not community priorities. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen sufficiently often. The second thing about turnover, and I mentioned this, is I'm aware turnover is going to happen. Clearly, you can't stop that. But the feedback again that I've heard many times is that this is thing that which gets touched on again and again and again, is that someone says, well, next week I'm going back to Melbourne or Sydney or Canberra or whatever, and X is going to take my job. And then the community then has to re-educate this next person a whole lot of things, and then, 10 months later they move on. Now that will happen. I suppose government departments and agencies need to reflect on those consequences a bit more and whether that change is necessary. But where it is necessary, to actually build in a proper process to allow communities to build that relationship of trust. Otherwise, trust goes up and down. And, I'm sure lots of people here have heard this, but, I've been told this so often. And so it's a real problem, and there should be a way of dealing with it.
Before we go to a second question from the floor, we'll take one from Slido, which is a fairly popular one at the moment from Neville. We often hear from local governments and their communities, particularly in rural and remote areas, that they don't have the resources and capacity to engage. So I know you've spoken a lot from the government side, which is we probably haven't spoken enough about the investment in resources on that side, but perhaps reflect on this one as well.
Well, one of the things that I touched on, and indeed our next report focuses a lot, is the fact that it goes back to this point about investing in social capital. For relatively small amounts of money, you can actually build a lot of social capital. And one of the things that unfortunately often gets cut first in times of economic downturn is this community outreach and community engagement. And community organisations, and have been told, quite openly by some community organisations in regional Victoria that, the grants that were given to their organisations, really small organisations, largely volunteer-based, but they may have one officer who's there full-time to do something, and if they can, instead of working 1 day a week, they're now working half a day a week or whatever. And it goes on to this second point about consultation fatigue, is that this is happening at the same time where many communities are feeling over-consulted, and because there's so many things happening, that we actually have more pressures put on them at the same time as the capacity for those small community organisations to deal with these issues, in fact, declining. So I know, people don't like to be told in government, oh, you need to provide some more money, but the amounts of money we're talking about in social capital building are minuscule compared to the amount that we use in physical capital building. And I know the Victorian Treasury has this early investment scheme where they look at issues around avoided costs, and I know avoided costs are sometimes a bit fuzzy, but if one looks at the broad issue I said at the beginning about the rise of grievance and extremism, the consequences of not investing in some of this stuff are really, really severe. And clearly, as I showed with the World Economic Forum, even, the leaders of the world's biggest businesses are conscious that the fact that you can't really conduct business in a world of uncertainty and fragmentation. So there are forces aware of this, and we actually need to put some money into social capital if we're going to stop that from happening.
We have another question that Lena's identified over there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thanks for the presentation. I'm Amisha Mehta from QUT. We've been researching around trust and designing risk and warning communication for trust over the last decade. But I'm really interested in hearing your views around distrust and how you see that in relationship to trust and what that might mean for design in this space. Thanks.
Well, I think one of the problems is that there is a small but growing percentage of community in Australia who distrust anything government tells them. And some of it, I think, also relates to, I think, the way in which government emergency services organisations use social media, because we tend to use social media as a broadcast tool. It's kind of like a digital letterboxing rather than a two-way thing. And part of that is because we do not have the processes or structures in place to conduct real-time conversations with people, so that when people don't trust, and they often don't trust what government says because they have an alternative source of information that they regard as equally valid. And we saw this in particular in the United States, at the moment, particular over issues around vaccines and stuff. You have to find ways of engaging the people who have distrust. And we tend not to engage with the people who distrust us. We continue to talk to the people who we have a good communication with and who do trust us, but we need to actually find better ways of getting into that. And it is a complex thing, because the other thing which we well know is that there are these bubbles in which people exist, in which everything reinforces their worldview, and it's very difficult for government to break into that, because government itself is often the organisation which is distrusted most of all. So how do we find alternative, trusted voices who can say things that communities will pick up on? Because someone in a uniform saying this is what's going on is just not going to cut through to those people who implicitly distrust all government organisations.
Mark, we have lots and lots of questions, and we actually are out of time, but I'm going to take one liberty, because knowing your background, you've actually worked at all three levels of government very extensively over a long career. We have a question here about what's the difference between the levels of trust in those governments? Is there a difference?
Well, it varies over time. And you actually see, well, local government tends to be more trusted than state or federal government. And we've seen over the last 20 years trust in state and federal government kind of crossing over at different times, depending on what's going on. It's interesting with state governments. I think people have a sense of greater control over what's happening because state government is actually closer to them and they automatically see it on the ground. The federal government, there was a view that the federal government was regarded as kind of this almost parental figure that sat at the top, and people respected it. But we saw some of the, during COVID, that actually went down quite a lot, and we saw some state governments really, in some parts of Australia, really, the trust for them really went up. I mean, there's a comment here about the increase in trust in 2021. It did go up during COVID for everyone, because, there was, we're all in this together, and everybody, for a brief period of time, trust really went up. And then it collapsed quite dramatically again because of issues and behaviours of different governments. And it depended on the behaviour of the government as to whether it was trusted or not. And the people from West Australia here, the West Australian government, by West Australians, was trusted enormously. The federal government wasn't. So, and in other states there were other views. But it did, going back to the kind of key thing, it did depend on the behaviours and processes that governments put in place.
Thank you very, very much for sharing your insights with us today, Mark. It's been a real pleasure. So would everybody please join me in thanking Mark for his thoughts today? Well done.